morning, everyone. We're really excited to have Kate here. Her time is very precious as she runs that international organization. And we're excited about her service. So Rogue Valley Housing Solutions, we are mission to bring housing solutions to the Rogue Valley. Specifically, we're doing this Zoom series, bringing in experts to do that. And we heard about Kate's service and really felt that it's so foundational to have a financial recovery to be able to afford housing, especially since we lost so much low-income housing. And it's a real concern how people are going to afford moving from their temporary housing into permanent housing. So that's why we're doing this call, and we hope you enjoy it. And I think that's it.
Great, thank you, Karen. And my name is Kaden Jones. I was a recent SU graduate, and I am now the events coordinator with Rogue Valley Housing Solutions. And Michaela, you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, y'all. I'm a recent SU grad as well, and I am the communications coordinator and also the note taker for these events. So we can always send you notes after this, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for joining us.
And before we begin, I'd like for you guys to know that, like Michaela said, you will receive notes of this call as well as a recording, and we create a highlight summary of some of the things that Kate will be speaking on, as well as a highlight video. And if you have not added your email to our newsletter, you can go ahead and provide that in the chat, as well as telling us who you are and what you're involved in. That would be great, and it'll give you access to all of our information. And now to introduce Kate. She is the visionary for the Financial Recovery Program with Money Management International. Go ahead, Kate.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I think these kind of forums where you're pulling people together like this and sharing information is so important and really key to the recovery overall. As you mentioned, my name is Kate Bulger. I am with Money Management International. We also go by MMI. We are a nonprofit counseling agency. We provide financial counseling, financial education, and assist with people with addressing their housing challenges from all walks of life and throughout all kinds of different situations. Our program that we're talking about here today is called Project Porchlight. Back in 2017, in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, our headquarters is in Sugar Land, Texas, right outside of Houston. What we saw was just an incredible number of our own employees who were devastated by a disaster, and an incredible number of people in the community who were struggling from disasters. That year, we had about 8% of the US population was directly impacted by a natural disaster, and unfortunately, that number has not fallen off significantly in the subsequent years. But what we saw was our own employees were struggling to work through recovering from that disaster. There is not a roadmap for it. There are skills that you never need in any other point in your life that you really need during a disaster to recover quickly. And we saw consumers coming from the community, and not just folks who had come to us for help directly from Hurricane Harvey, but folks who've been impacted by other disasters who were coming to us 2 and 3 years later, letting us know that they were still working to recover from things like Hurricane Sandy and other major disasters, because it's so hard to get through and it takes so much time. So we took about a year and worked with our own employees who were recovering. We worked with employees who had recovered from disasters before, and we worked with our clients, our existing clients, to really understand what are the things that each of these disasters have in common, and what are the skill gaps that we can fill as financial educators. And we pulled that all together, and it essentially became a series of services that we had already been offering and just needed formalizing into a single service, and created Project Porchlight. And so Project Porchlight is staffed by HUD certified housing counselors who specialize in disaster recovery. They've had about 160 hours of disaster specific education, and most of the team, because of Harvey, unfortunately, most of the team themselves have had to recover from a natural disaster. So they have that wealth of experience. And so Project Porch Light is a program where a client works with a disaster coach who takes stock of where they are in their situation. So we walk through, what are the steps they've already taken? What are the things that they need to do outstanding? What are their priorities and their needs and their current financial situation? And where are they trying to go in their recovery? So really understanding what's the point where they feel they have recovered. What was their financial normal before this? We create a plan, a long-term plan with that consumer with really specific goals and milestones and things that they need to achieve over time so that they can meet that recovery goal. And we then stick with that consumer and provide ongoing coaching and ongoing check-ins with them at least once a month, sometimes more frequently, to make sure that they're hitting those goals. Excuse me. Sorry about that. And what that does is, none of it sounds like it is, particularly magic, right? None of it sounds like it is especially earth-shattering. But having someone who's been through it before and whose skills you can essentially borrow as you're encountering these new challenges makes a huge difference. And having someone there who can help give you that extra push and keep that forward momentum going in your recovery is really important. Because what we see, and what I understand is already starting to happen right now after the fires, is that you have this, in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, this crush of folks who come in to help. There's funding, there's assistance, there's grant dollars frequently, FEMA steps in, SBA steps in, and then that crisis period ends and that assistance really goes away. And, consumers end up going through a year to a year and a half of nothing new, nothing enormous and earth-shattering coming in that can help really change their situation as far as the financial end is concerned. And then, after about a year to a year and a half, we start to see community development block grants for disaster recovery come into communities. But in that in-between period, if consumers aren't making forward progress on their recovery, then they end up getting left behind by the recovery. And the things that the consumers don't know about recovery are the things that typically hold them back. And so having that counselor there, giving them goals, keeping them on track, keeping them from getting stuck is really what makes the long-term difference. One of the challenges that we know is out there and that we've seen again and again is folks who end up stuck, particularly those who are in housing assistance programs where FEMA may be providing temporary housing for them. If they don't get unstuck, then the real consequence of that as they come to the end of that assistance period is that they're suddenly facing a homelessness crisis at the same time they're trying to recover. And so trying to really work with those consumers closely and make sure they're hitting their goals is really critical. There's a few sort of common challenges that we see. The first one is really the bureaucracy of the process, right? I like to tell people, think about the very first time you had to fill out your taxes all by yourself without maybe a parent or a sibling helping you out, right? That was not a comfortable moment for most of us, right? It is high stakes. It is super technical. It's not typically something you've had experience with before. And it's something where if you get it right, there's not a lot of benefit, but if you get it wrong, it's a serious problem, right? A lot of disaster recovery is that same way. We have folks who are being asked to fill out these really bureaucratic forms that are different than anything else they've had to fill out in their life. They're navigating, the insurance process. They're navigating through FEMA and through SBA, and it's not clear how those things are the same, how they're different, what the different roles are. SBA in particular poses a challenge for folks. The idea that you don't have to own a business to get a small business administration disaster assistance loan is, not intuitive for folks. And so as they're working through these things, you see folks, even when they're super well-intentioned, they are doing everything they can. The frustration of trying to work through those programs just grinds people down, and not understanding what benefit these things can bring, and filling out these repetitive applications, having to tell your story over and over again. Having someone there who can explain where the coach comes in, they'll explain why it's important and what you're doing, and then help you fill out those forms, help you understand what it means when they're asking for, all of your bank statements, including the blank pages, which is not something that makes immediate sense to folks, right? And so by having that coach there to step in and guide you through that bureaucratic process, help you understand, what to do when FEMA declines your application, and the fact that for FEMA in particular, for instance, they don't have a way of telling someone you forgot to include a picture of your driver's license, or maybe the picture you took of this of your utility bill was just a little too blurry, so please send a better picture in. The only way they can do that is by declining an application and then hoping that someone will appeal that declination with the extra missing paperwork. If you don't know that and you're going through this disaster and it has been, already just an incredibly difficult process, and you get that declination letter from FEMA, chances are you're going to just put it away. Most people don't realize that that means please appeal. They look at it and just say, I've been declined, and it's over. And so having that coach there to explain things like that to folks and to help work with folks is huge. The next most common challenge that we see is having trouble understanding their options. So because our disaster coaches have done this for a long time, because they've had to recover themselves and they've had so much training, the options that are available to people at different parts of their recovery are really clear for our counselors. And probably for a lot of the folks on this call are pretty clear, because you've been doing this kind of work in this space now for a minute. But to consumers going through it for the first time, it is not super clear how things are different or the same, or even what they mean. And so being able to really parse out and explain, you're facing a decision point, here are what these options mean, and here's how we can think through the pros and cons of these things, is a big help, and is a place where counselors can really make a difference for folks. And then help sticking to a budget. And this is tough. One of the things that we see, like in life in general, sticking to a budget is just hard for some folks. I talk about it often like it's dieting, right? Some people it is pretty easy to sort of, stick to a diet that works for them. Getting in their fruits and vegetables is really easy. For other people like me, it is not an easy road, right? It's not something that comes naturally. And so I'm always fighting myself and trying to prioritize. Spending is really a lot the same, right? You've got all of these things coming in saying, you could spend money on this, you could spend money on that, you owe money to me. And especially during a disaster, you still have all of the expenses from before your disaster, and you have all of these new expenses coming to you after a disaster. And so many people who would gladly help you by taking your money, or even scam people out of their money. And so trying to stick to a budget, especially when on top of all of that, your job may have changed, your income may have changed, because the disaster frequently destroys your home. You're often living further from your job, spending more on gas. You're often spending more on housing in the short term. And so all of these things really come together, and having a counselor who can just sit down and say, okay, we're going to prioritize your expenses today. And what we plan to spend today may be really different than the way your budget looks in a week. And so having a counselor there who can walk you through what those budget changes mean, how your spending priorities are going to change throughout your disaster, is really important, because at the end of the day, our goal is to make sure that we are not just delivering someone back to financial normal, but also trying to minimize the amount of borrowing that they do during their recovery. Because what we see is folks who don't respond quickly to their budget changes, who are making decisions about their options that might not always be advantageous, right? It's easy to borrow money, unfortunately. And sometimes that can feel like the right decision when it's in the moment, when it's not necessarily the decision that you want for yourself in the long term. So having that counselor there to minimize the borrowing makes a big difference. In the aftermath of a disaster, in those couple of years after recovery, what we typically see is, without any assistance, the average consumer's credit score has fallen between 25 and 60 points. And that's a huge drop. That limits your ability to borrow, that changes your ability to qualify for credit, that changes how much you're going to pay, as your down payment for a loan, or your security deposit for a new apartment. Like that, it is expensive to have a low credit score. By working through with a counselor, The average consumer we work with, their credit score improves by 6 points over the course of the disaster, the recovery. And so that is not a huge improvement, but the big win there is that it's preventing it from falling. So if we can keep somebody where they were before the disaster, that is a huge success overall. The next challenge we see people face related to this is the affordability of recovery. Very frequently, the folks that we see who are impacted by a disaster, they are who are most deeply impacted by disaster are the folks who are least able to afford a big rebuild, right? They are frequently folks where their home has been around for a long time. It's an established house that was built, maybe in the 50s, maybe in the 70s, but it's not a new build typically. And so the cost of rebuilding can become incredibly expensive and can often exceed the amount of insurance that someone has on the house, even when they have really great insurance. And just a few things that we can do. First is just helping people understand that their rebuild might not look like their original home, which is tough. It's an emotionally difficult thing. The next thing that we can help folks do is really understand how they can cobble together different programs. There are grant programs out there for folks who qualify. There are frequently assistance programs that come up in the community development block grant funds that are made available after the disaster that can help reimburse people for what they're spending. And there are really smart choices that people can make about borrowing that they do to rebuild. And so helping folks make those smart decisions on the front end mean that after the disaster, they aren't suddenly burdened with this incredible amount of debt. I think my favorite success story that we have is a consumer who came in. She had been impacted by the fire in Paradise. She lost her home. She was a senior living on a fixed income and did not have as much insurance on her home as she really needed. When she came to us, she had been declined for some local assistance that had been offered. She had not applied for SBA funds. She had not appealed her FEMA decision, and she really just wasn't sure where to go or what to do. And so her first call with her counselor was just her crying, because she's going through just this incredible grief of the life that she had that she felt she had lost. And on top of that, dealing with the trauma that occurs after a disaster, right? Surviving a disaster is an incredibly traumatic experience. And so she is dealing with all of these emotions and all of this grief and was worried that she was going to become homeless. We spent hours on the phone with her over many months. And now we were able to get her a $10,000 grant to help begin her rebuild. And we were able to find her 2 loans with, one is a forgivable loan. The other one is a super low interest loan that's specifically designed for low income households. And she is on track to finish her rebuild, hopefully this year, assuming that the outbreak allows things to start moving apace at some point. But we're really excited for her because even though the house isn't the house that she had, it's going to be smaller than the home that she had originally. It's going to be a little bit different, 1 level instead of 2. She is so excited about the house that she's going to have because she knows it's affordable. She knows it's a payment that she's going to be able to comfortably make and still live on her retirement. And, it's a house that she, has a stake in and already feels like is hers. And so that is my favorite personal story of recovery for a client and affordability. Really, the next thing, and I touched on it a minute ago, that people really encounter is this grief and trauma that they encounter during a disaster. One of the challenges that we hear is that folks, if you are fortunate enough to have never been through an incredibly traumatic event, then that is fantastic. But unfortunately, if you've been through a traumatic event before, you know how intrusive it can become and how hard it can be just to get through day after day and do the most basic things to keep your life moving, right? And so very frequently what we hear from consumers, especially who were involved in a fire in particular, is that the applications that were available initially and the decisions that they were making immediately in the aftermath of the fire are not the decisions or choices that they would have made if they had had a little bit more time, because that trauma and that fear of a second fire, that if they had an evacuation where they had to go very quickly, if they left home one morning and during work the home was lost, that is an incredibly tough thing. And so one of the things our counselors are trained on specifically is really trauma-informed counseling. And so we're helping people make decisions that are not just decisions for that moment, but are decisions that they can live with over the long term. So it's things like helping people understand that if you had a mortgage on your home, you get your insurance funds. For many, many people in the immediate aftermath of a fire, they think they want to leave forever. They want to no longer have the home. They're going to go move somewhere else where there is less danger of fire in the future. And so they use that insurance funds to repay that mortgage. And that is super challenging because it means that person, if over time we tend to see is that people who've made that decision initially regret it. They begin to get some distance from that trauma and some distance from the events, and start to really remember how much they loved their community and loved their neighbors and loved kind of that soul of their town, right? And so helping people, understand what decisions they can put off, like repaying the mortgage, and what decisions maybe are more critical, like choosing to go ahead and apply for SBA funds, is a big help and can help folks have more time in the long term to make their decisions. Because at the end of the day, if you use your insurance funds to pay off your mortgage, unfortunately, you don't have funds left over to rebuild. And so that is one of the big things that we hear as a mistake that people really struggle with. The other challenge that we hear, and that we hear really frequently, is that folks who are trying to recover from a disaster are also folks that are targeted by scam artists. And it comes in all shapes and sizes. It comes in the immediate critical aftermath of the disaster all the way through. And I'll tell you, even one of our employees who helped us design Project Porchlight, she was actually hit by 2 separate hurricanes several years apart in 2 completely different states. And in the second hurricane, even though she had recovered from a disaster before she knew what she was doing, she's a counselor, she ended up falling victim to a contracting scam because she just, she had so many decisions to make. She just didn't think about looking through that contract. So counselors help people understand and remember what are the really important things to look for, like making sure that your contractor is licensed in your state. And Oregon does a really good job of making sure that those are searchable and things that people can find, and making sure that people read through their contracts and look at multiple contracts, don't just look at one contractor's contract, right? But having a counselor to help keep those things at top of mind helps people avoid the common scams that are out there, and keeps their recovery moving forward. So it is really easy for consumers to reach us for Project Porchlight. We have a special number just for folks who are struggling to recover from the Alameda fire. People can call us at 877-565-5492. We are 24/7, so they can call anytime, day or night, and they will reach us. A human answers that phone. We offer service in both English and in Spanish. We also offer translation services for about 185 other languages. So if they're whatever language the consumer prefers to talk about their finances in, we're able to accommodate that. So sorry, I just lost my train of thought there for a second. We also have a website that people can go to if they'd like to learn more. It is porchlight.org. So porchlight.org. And people can go there and connect with the counselor as well. I think that is all that I have. I'm not sure how I did on time there.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. Real quickly, could you speak on how you would tailor suggestions or counseling for people who do not have citizenship documentation or don't have bank accounts or credit?
Absolutely. And I will say, unfortunately, we see this quite a bit. The folks who are, at highest risk, and the folks who are most kind kind of disadvantaged in getting services from day to day are the folks that really struggle the most through a recovery. So we provide service regardless of someone's citizenship status or their documentation status. At the end of the day, the basics of disaster recovery, while there may be some things that they can't apply for, some grants that won't accept applications from undocumented individuals or from people who aren't citizens. The nuts and bolts of, we need to make a plan to recover from this disaster. We need to understand what your goals are. We need to stick with this long term and continue to check in. That all is really the same. If they have insurance, then we still help them work with that insurance company, help them understand, your homeowner's insurance or your renter's insurance is not the same as your car insurance, right? It's a very different experience working through that. And we have a lot of experience working with people who are unbanked and not just helping them recover from a disaster, but helping them get banked, since that really is key to their future. But, making sure that we have folks who are in safe, stable, and affordable housing that is long-term and not just temporary housing recovery is really key and specifically important for that population, since it can be a real struggle.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate, for all of your insight. And we're so happy to have you come here and speak on your recovery program.